I think we'll get started. We have one panelist that will still join us. But I have to say, I'm really excited about this panel. Can you all hear me talk really nice about you all? Because it's going to be nice stuff I say. So I'll start with the person I haven't met on the panel is Christina Colón, who writes, she's a writer and editor and storyteller. She embarked on her first editorial role at the age of 9 when she co-founded the short-lived investigative neighborhood newspaper, the Pig Street Times. Since then, Christina has served as the associate editor of Sojourners Magazine, the communications manager of the Nonprofit Association of Washington, and as an editor at Global Press Journal, where she coached women reporters in more than 40 communities around the world. He is currently pursuing a master's degree in emerging media studies at Boston University, where she is a teaching assistant for the College of Communications 101 course, The Human Storyteller. Christina is the social media project lead at the Uproot Project, an organization that uplifts and supports journalists of color who have been underrepresented in the journalism industry and has published work with the National Press Club, Journalism Institute, the Faith and Money Network, and Sojourners. And she was an associate editor of Sojourners Magazine, which we share in common. So welcome, Christina. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Khai Clardy lives and works in Minneapolis as a media and content specialist for Nuger, where she kickstarted a strategic diversity plan for the agency in 2021. As a certified DEI practitioner, Khai consults various clients on DEI communications and strategies. She created an internal and external language style guide as the first action item for Nuger's DEI committee. And I met Khai just a week ago or week and a half ago at an event called the Common Good event that Nuger provides for people that they work with. And I was sitting at a table with one of her colleagues talking about this panel, and she said, "Oh, you have to meet Khai. Khai geeks out over style guides." So, Khai, it's good to have you here too.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Jim Rice, up in the upper panel there, is a senior editor of Sojourners Magazine in Washington, D.C. He was the magazine's editor for the past 16 years up until August, and managing editor before that. He started at Sojourners as an organizer after serving 2 years in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. Jim is a native of Richland, Washington, the bedroom community of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, and a member of Hyattsville Mennonite Church outside of DC. And Jim provides hospitality for me when I go to DC, so I get to stay with him and Dawn. And Ross Murray already kind of said this, but he is a native of Minnesota, though it's been, what, 10 years since you've lived here?
Yeah, it's been 11 now.
11 years since he's lived here. And so I first met him when he was here. He's a deacon, and he's vice president of the GLAD Media Institute, which provides activist, spokesperson, and media engagement training and education for LGBTQ and allied community members, the media industry, and advocacy organizations desiring to deepen their media impact. He specializes in the relationship between religion and LGBTQ people. His book, Made Known, Love, Developed LGBTQ Inclusive Youth Ministry, is available from Fortress Press. He has written and appeared on numerous media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, USA Today, The Washington Post, Huffington Post, and Religion News Service. He is a member of the 2021 Out 100 and was named one of Mashable's 10 LGBTQ rights activists to follow on Twitter. So it's a pretty great panel that we have of kind of national quality folks, and we're excited to have them. So maybe we can welcome them with some applause, and then we'll.
Hi, panelists. So we're going to start off with some questions. The student staff has some questions made up for you guys, and then we'll head out into audience questions. So the first question we have is, we'd like you to share an instance when having a style guide was really important to either a story or a project you were working on? And anyone can go first.
I think I can go first. We actually just recently, for Indigenous Peoples Day, wanted to put out some communication. And I was kind of out of the office this week, and I feel like before the language guide was complete, if that wasn't there, it would have probably not happened, because while we can do research on it and create our content, we also want to make sure that we're speaking in our tone. And so the beauty of a language guide is it kind of meshes your brand's tone and voice with what terms are more acceptable. And we want to use person first language and make sure that we are being inclusive of all communities. So that's a very recent incident. And it was really beautiful to watch my coworkers be able to put all that together without my hands on it. So just having that resource really helped move the project.
I have a bit of a more personal example, but my name is Christina Colón, which has an accent mark in my last name. And up until 2019, accent marks were actually prohibited or discouraged for being published according to the Associated Press Style Guide. And so it was really hard to see that my name was not really my name when it was printed according to a nationally regarded, really religiously followed style guide by many journalists. So in a few months before AP did make the switch, which was in 2019, I joined an organization called Global Press Journal, and they had their own style guide, which is publicly accessible. It's called the Global Press Style Guide, which I had the honor to work on during my time with them. But they had basically a section that said that accent marks were part of a complete name, that they were in fact required to be included because it wasn't someone's name without it. And so that was a moment where I really felt seen and included. And for the first time, my name wasn't a problem. It was part of the story. And that was really a moment where I watched the style guide have a really personal impact. And I knew that that was always the case, but it really resonated with me and showed me why it matters, how we present the language we use and how we think about our style guides.
I'll follow that just because I think the work that GLAD does sort of overlaps with some of, it's very parallel to what Christina just talked about. So GLAD, we have our own media reference guide, and I'm putting it in the chat, which makes no sense for you're all sitting in a room, you can't see the chat or access it, but it's there. And part of the reason why we have that is about language and terminology for the LGBTQ community. And it's not just for us as an organization, but also in terms of working with and influencing religiously followed style guides like the Associated Press. And so working to have their language and terminology match up with what is the best representation for the community as well. And so over the years, you can see these shifts from discouraging the use of homosexual toward gay or LGBTQ, things like that. And then where I find it the most helpful as an advocate is there are still stories that will misgender a transgender person, often after a violent murder. There are instances where the style guide isn't followed. And we do outreach to journalists, we do outreach to editors and publishers, to say, hey, this is inaccurate. It can be offensive. And it's not just me, Ross Murray, saying that, but also now we have a source that we can point to and try to offer that as an opportunity of we can help you tell and do this story better. Here are guidelines, not just definitions and for terms, but also guidelines for usage and how to talk about people and how to refer to them, and kind of breaking down the do this, don't do this. And then we do a lot of kind of follow-up of what does that look like? What does that mean? And so I find the style guide really helpful because then it doesn't mean it's just my opinion. It sort of is something that we have put intentional thought and effort and intentionality into building so that it can be one of the best representations for the community to be accessed by people that are not a part of the community. And that's the overlap that we're always thinking about for us in the organization.
I'll continue the theme. I think this is a variation of the same thing my colleagues have been saying. I mentioned to my wife the topic of the other day, the topic of our conversation, and she said, boring. And I said, no. She said, why don't you just have them read a dictionary? I said, no. There's theological and political choices that are made in your uses of style. And I said, do you call it Myanmar or Burma? Do you say Latino, Latina, Latinx? Do you say Hispanic? Those are political choices that you're making, or identification choices. Do you capitalize Black, which AP did not until what, 2 years ago? Those are 2 years ago, 2020, I think. Those are all political choices. Do you say Eucharist or communion? Do you capitalize communion or not? Trinity, do you capitalize that? Or so those choices are part of your message. We communicate not only in the content of what we say and in the art and how we present things, but also in our word choices and our style choices. So there are a lot of important implications to the choices we use, and our style guides reflect that. I will add one kind of quick anecdote. I've been going through, and we can come back to this in a few minutes, I guess, but our style guide had a kind of a funny evolution because it was kind of before the days when AP was online. So looking up stuff in AP was pulling down a paper book and looking it up, and it was kind of clunky. So I was kind of the keeper of our style guide for many years. And so I just kept adding stuff to it, even stuff that's already on AP, because I could search for it quickly. And so it grew to 42 single space pages with 10,600 words, not entries, but words, including the definitions, out of control, but you could look for anything. And Christina, you can mention more details about that. Christina had the job over the last year or so of going through and paring it down to really be exceptions to AP rather than all that stuff. But I did notice, and here's the quick anecdote, I did notice that Bob Holting still survives in one of the examples. It's under hyphens. It says use hyphens rather than slashes. The Hultine Rice article. so Bob, you live on in our style guide. Although I noticed Christina eliminated that in her revision. So you're about to disappear.
Yeah, thank you for that. You guys kind of mentioned some culture shifts and culture changes in the stories that you were talking about. And so we wanted to know more about what your process is to make adjusting, to make sure that your language is inclusive when we're noticing those culture shifts and changes.
I can start this one because the style guide that we just released is the 11th edition, and it just came out earlier this year. The previous 10th edition was published in 2016. Do not wait 5 years in between two of these because, oh my goodness, language, it changes and evolves very quickly. And we were recognizing it was outdating. And the hard part was the longer it was taking us to do the new version, the more things changed and the more like outdated this looks. So I spent a good chunk of last year kind of like apologizing and then extra explaining the stuff that wasn't in the guide, or like, this is what's new. So we actually now are just thinking internally, right? This is also, the digital revolution has changed some of this too. There was a time that, these had to be hard copy published and hard copy shared. And then for a while they lived as PDFs on our website. And so there was hesitancy to like adjust this PDF because we knew that they were being printed out and sitting in reporters' desks everywhere. This one only exists as a web page. There's no PDF version. So you lose that like printability, tactile quality, which I'm sure some people, but it will make the editing easier in the future. And we sort of have a point person at GLAD that is managing this. And she was kind of the editor of putting this together. And I will say, it is hard to put this together. We can't just say, this is the definition, what we think is one organization, because we're trying to represent a really big, broad, diverse community. So there's a lot of like running definitions or explanations by partner organizations who really are the leads. Did they have the best way of talking about it? There's political movement buy-in, like we want what we publish to be representative of the community, not just us as an organization. So that's why it takes a long time to do the updating. What we're doing now with this online version is as we see evolutions or changes in language, we're making notes of that. And it is going to be, I don't know yet if it's every 6 months or every 1 year, going in and doing revisions. So it's not constant revisions because then it's hard for people to keep up and it feels like the rules are changing. But at least it is a much more intentional and a quicker, easier edit than we have to completely redo this style guide over and over again. And so we can do that. And that's one of the things we've kind of been able to shift. The internet helps us to do that a little bit easier. And we can sort of be intentional of saying, we are making this change now, as opposed to here's the brand new edition that encompasses a bunch of changes all at once.
Yeah, I think, Ross, you touched on a really important word there, which is intentionality. And I think anytime you're approaching a style guide, it really has to be an intentional process. You know, there's sometimes a tendency of wanting to be reactive when it comes to language shifts. And I think recognizing that there are people at the end of the stories that we produce that, you know, that the words we choose do have real ramifications. And so it is that a thoughtful process that has to take place over time. When I was at Global Press, we met weekly to talk about our style guide. I don't think that that's feasible for every organization or necessary, but for us, it was. We had a 1-hour meeting every week to just review a few words and really ask why. You know, that was a big question of why are we using this word? What does it mean? And for every word that we included in our guide, we had to provide a rationale. So that meant that it wasn't just that we had a definition of what it meant, but a why of why we included it and why we were using it. And I think that that is a huge thing when you think about your style guide is the why. Why are you including this word? Why does it matter to the communities that you're talking to? Why does it matter that you publish it now? And so I think really thinking about your why, and also just not feeling the need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. I think, you know, I'm so glad that Ross is here, because Gladys has been such a resource for me personally. There are so many wonderful resources already out there that exist, and so many people who have dedicated that time, since it is a very time-intensive process that you can turn to as a source, as a guide, as a resource to inform your own work. You don't have to start from scratch. And I think that's the other part that makes being intentional so much easier. It's because a lot of people have already put in that time and energy and intentionality.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, that's kind of the theme throughout our style guide. We're a very small company. Our clients range from, you know, a bulk of our clients range from small to mid-sized organizations. And so GLAD has been an amazing resource. And again, the theme in our language style guide is rationale and resources. Like, we are not afraid to throw links into things. Like, I think right now we're at like 60 pages, and that's with links all throughout to kind of like, okay, I don't want to spend 500 words explaining this word, so I'll just, you know, send you to this resource, which is really great. But another theme is listening to the people, and we encourage our staff to feel free to kind of question certain things as they, you know, do their research, or as they're working with clients, or as they're, you know, in their communities. You know, we have a very open dialogue. You don't have to be working on the style guide per se to give feedback or question something. And I think that that really helps our process of being open to updating. It makes it feel less of a, we have to get this done and we have to see it through. It makes it feel like it's an ongoing process, which it is. It's a journey. It's never necessarily complete. Culture will always change. But I think listening to the people and being intentional with the resources has been our process. Whether it's a friend, you know, conversation, and it can change your perspective, just questioning that, and then going and doing more research and looking into those resources and seeing what do other guides say, what are other organizations saying, and kind of find that alignment with our values and the terms.
One small note about our process: we're much smaller than Ross, than you know, GLAD with you know, nationwide implications. We have a small editorial staff, and so we have a much more organic, you know, change. We can change one thing at a time, and it just an email or a Slack note will go out to folks saying, you know, something on a current issue, for example, you know, might be in the news, and you know, is it Kiev or Kiev, you know, how you spell something or what have you. And so we can send that out and then update the style guide as we go. So it's a pretty organic process and document. you can't do that if you're, you know, if you have to, we don't really have additions. It just kind of evolves with language.
Yeah, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what would this kind of process look like in a congregational communicators context?
The first thing that comes to mind to me is there are a lot of, you know, each of us has specific language and words and things that we deal with. And so it seems to me, you have denominational language that you want to make, that you're doing style choices on. You have geographic, local kind of things. You have things, the church, you have names, like as Christina was talking about, you have, you know, so the things that are specific to your work are really important to be naming, because they're not going to be in RNA, Religion News Writers Association or AP style guides. So those kinds of things, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
I think, you know, a lot of times we do operate without even knowing it according to some sort of internalized style guide. So, you know, you'll find that when you go through, you know, pamphlets, websites, that there are certain words or phrases or ways that you refer to events or communities consistently. And so I think that's a huge resource, is just already knowing that you've been using certain language consistently and then taking that opportunity to evaluate it. You know, is it working? Do people who we want to include in our congregations, like, do they resonate with these words? Are we excluding anyone? And so I think, you know, when it comes to that, it's really just knowing your mission, you know, knowing your audience, knowing your community, and working with what you have. I think that is a huge thing, is that you don't have to, you know, you're never starting with nothing. You already have something. It's just seeing that and using that to build off of.
Yeah, I think building your own working sheet that's very context specific, and then you link out to all of these other ones that already exist. You don't need to replicate everything that we've done, but you can also say, this is what we're going to do. And you know, it is basic stuff. Jim said this before. Is Eucharist or communion, is that capitalized at our church? Yes or no? And whatever, I don't care what the choice is, as long as you like make that and it's your choice. What language do you use for God, or do we use for people in a collective? You know, knowing that these are things that you're going to do or say or write a lot in your communications, just having that as a quick and easy thing, which probably doesn't have to be more than a couple pages. And then below, you've got links out to ours and to others to say, okay, occasionally something's going to come up, right? And now we're going to write something more LGBTQ specific. You don't have to write that, since you're not doing it every single day, but you also say, here's the link to go to Glad's guide, or here's the link to go to someone else's guide, to kind of fill in the stuff where, you know, kind of your everyday sort of mode is going to look. So I think, you know, think of the questions that you answer the most frequently, and then you can kind of, you know, the other stuff can sort of follow, because all these are designed to help you do your job easier and better, and make it kind of quick and efficient, and to have some of those conversations about, this is what's important to us. We will capitalize Eucharist. We will capitalize Trinity. You know, those are the words that you're probably saying the most, more than what's the right LGBTQ acronym, something like that.
Awesome. So I'm in communications, there is like also always in style guides, there is like the written process, but there's also like the photographic branding process as well. So is there such a thing as over branding, and why or why not?
Khai, you go first.
I don't know why that question just did that. I wouldn't say over branding per se. That's a tricky one for me. But what I would say is, especially in terms of a style guide, we definitely, for a best practice, want to just use plain language. When you consider different cultures and ethnicities and, you know, religious beliefs, certain colloquialisms don't hit the same, and they can cause a disconnect from people. So I think sometimes we use, for example, a good way to do something creative would be like to create your own acronym that is, you know, for your brand, and have different acronyms Another is to kind of use terms that, again, most people from other countries or religions may not understand. So I think it can do the same damage as over branding could, where it's just creating a disconnect with the community or the consumer that you're trying to reach. Yeah, that's a tricky one, but you can go ahead, Ross.
I laughed because I was sort of going down one road of like the photographic style guide piece, and then when you went to over branding, I was like, oh, those are, to me, those are two different directions. But and I sort of laughed too because one of the things that we've done at GLAD was started to work with Getty Images, right? One of the biggest places that does images, just because their own guides, and they have a lot of photographers uploading a lot of different things and tagging them on whatever they did, and actually working with them to create standards and styles for what gets included. Noting that for example, we started the biggest one with transgender people, and things were getting uploaded that were drag queens, and they were just getting tagged as transgender, or people that weren't transgender were getting tagged, and so or mislabeled. And so we're doing that with them, which was this, like, again, kind of a gigantic process that is more than what you will necessarily have to do. But I do think, your photography, your images that you're using often convey even more meaning than the words that you're writing. And so they are a reflection, they're probably a more accurate reflection on your community. So if you're using stock images of people that aren't actually in your congregation, you're giving a false impression of the congregation. And even if your congregation isn't as diverse as what you want to convey, knowing that you're using stock images versus the real people that doesn't have the diversity, there's a difference there. And there's some value judgment in like what's going to make the most sense there. But making sure that you've got people that are being community members that are showing up, being present, and having people see the actual life of the congregation, because the people that are members of your congregation are already members, right? They, for whatever reason, they like it, they're participating, they're showing up. And in some ways you're communicating with them because you want to increase their activity. And then there's the people outside of the church, and what do they see and hear and know about your church? And that's the branding piece of like, how do you want to be seen and known and recognized? And then how much does that match the reality when they, if they show up in the door? What kind of reputation do you want them to have for your church? And so answering questions like that, especially visually, makes a really big difference in terms of what you talk about, what issues are important to you, the words you use, and the images that you use do a lot of reflection on that. And I can't give you hard and fast rules for what that's like, but recognizing that you've got two different audiences there, and those two different audiences are kind of looking at and for different things.
Yeah, I think that point about does it match reality is really important, because when I think about brand and branding, I think about trust. And trust is really achieved by authenticity, by, being honest, and, creating a consistent communication, messaging, and tone that people come to depend on. They know who you are, even if they don't know all the people behind that brand creation. And so I think there's a part of I do think that there is an opportunity to over brand, because you almost try to almost extend beyond who you really are. It's like there's so many exciting projects you can take on, different, terminology that you can use, exciting things you're doing internally. But at the end of the day, like, you really have to think about, like, what is our core mission? What are we really, like, if we were to just go down to what we're doing, who we are, who we want to be, then how would that then transform our brand to represent that? What, words do we really want to use? What messages we want to repeat? What colors? I think about the fact that the brands can be so expressive. And so I don't think it needs to be complicated, or you need to have too much happening. I think it really just has to be something that people can grasp, that they can relate to, and that they can see that you're being authentic and someone that they can trust through your branding.
I like that you mentioned colors. I meant to mention that earlier as well. I've definitely done like case studies on different colors and how it resonates to people. And I think that it's something that gets overlooked sometimes in the branding conversation. Like you go to design, you have your conversations about fonts and things like that, and then you kind of move forward. And I think that it's great to note that there are ways to find language to actually mimic and back up the different colors you use. Like when you think of when you think of blue, you think of royalty. Okay, now we're thinking of different terms and actions that can align with that. And I think that's a really great way to kind of get down and break, because again, you can get excited and want to overextend yourself. And I think that's a really great way to stay grounded.
Thank you, guys. The staff has one more question before we move on to audience questions. The last question is, why do you love style guides?
Because I'm a word nerd. No, I love style guides. I just think it's really fascinating. I think also because I went to journalism school, and so just always had some type of guide, and like memorizing or like being very in tune with AP, Associated Press style guide, is like something that just makes me feel good. But even more than that, I as a writer, I think, and as an editor, having a guide is kind of your outline sometimes in what you're doing. And I love hearing other perspectives. I love challenging my own perspective. And I think that's exactly what style guides do. In creating our style guide, I thought I had even just the African American and or the woman sections like down packed. Like I don't need to do any research. And I learned so much in just creating it. So I think the fact that it's always changing, I think the fact that it speaks to so many different perspectives and how people see themselves is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think similarly, I studied sociology in undergrad, and so I've always seen language as something that can connect us or disconnect us. And so this opportunity to really think about the impact that words have and how we can help be curators of connection, that these aren't just that language, yes, it can be casual, but its impact is intentional, that it's deep. And so I just think it's an awesome opportunity to take that step back and to really say, like, why are we saying this? What impact does it have? And how can we foster more connection with our words?
I am admittedly not a word nerd like Khai, but so why I like style guides, I think so, and I come to this from advocacy as well. I find it to be a very helpful tool, right? Like people are looking, I assume good intentions and people want to do the right thing and often just don't know. And I want to send them to a place like, here's where you can go check this, right? Here's where you can go find some guidelines. Maybe there's some are hard and fast rules and some are like just more guidelines for how to think about things, but it becomes a way that helps compel the story. Glad used to have a tagline for a while that was words and images matter. And it was what is being said, what is being displayed, really for most people creates reality around them. And if they don't see or hear stories, if they don't see communities being represented, or if they don't see them being represented or talked about accurately, that perceives what they think the reality is. And so creating this has been a really helpful way for us to use as we're working with content creators, journalists, others. Sorry, when my phone rings, it's something messes up my ears. I want to say one other thing about our guide too, because it's very careful. I mentioned that we're trying to like represent a bigger, broader community and work with a lot of partners there. I have two caveats that I always say when I present the GLAAD Media Reference Guide. And one is it's written by Americans, probably for a very American context, and other countries have wanted to just like translate it or use it. And I've often said, you can use what's helpful, but you've got to do your own like cultural check of whether this makes sense in your context. And some things will and some things won't. And I'm fine if you throw out the stuff that's not helpful or rewrite it or adapt it as necessary. And that's true even for other English-speaking countries. The second thing that I will say is that this guide is designed for non-LGBTQ people, right? Journalists and content creators who are trying to tell the story of the community that they're not necessarily a part of, which means it is a very base level document, low bar, don't be offensive kind of document. It does not have all the careful nuance that really still exists intra community. And I have to be very clear, I am not telling LGBTQ people how to talk about themselves. They should use the words and the language and the descriptors that are the most accurate for them. What this is a how to avoid some of the most major pitfalls. And one of our guidelines is use the language and terminology that a person uses to talk about themselves, right? That will trump the other definitions that we give you or the things to help point, because this is really designed for how do people, I just came back from Australia. And so the term I heard a lot was don't be shit, gets used a lot. And I feel like that's what this document sort of is that is a don't be shit document. And then to do the above and beyond, to do it well, to be fair and accurate and inclusive and groundbreaking, you will have to go beyond this base level to be able to do that. And so just know there's always that distinction. And for LGBTQ people that look at it and say, you know, this seems oversimplistic. Yes, it probably is, because we're trying to reach a community that doesn't know anything at all, perhaps that is at zero, and a community that wants to see themselves being accurately represented, and trying to kind of hold those two things in tension at the same time.
And for me, it's, again, it feels like a variation on themes that we've been touching on for the whole conversation. But for me, it's the important, words are not neutral. The choices, they're you know, and in journalism, there's no such thing as an objective journalist. And we're very explicit about that. We're advocacy journalists at Sojourners, but I think that's what the church's call is. We're to be instruments of social change. And so the language we use is very important in that, and has, again, I think others have sort of said this, but the words have implications and they have connotations that are really important in as we're communicating our direct messages. There are also indirect messages that are as important in how we communicate. So yeah, I think it's the reason I love style guides is because that's a way that we express that, and we parse that out, and we've mentioned intentionality. That's a place where we're really intentional about those choices because they matter, and they matter in our ability to communicate what we're trying to communicate, which for us, and I think for congregational communicators, is the gospel, and the gospel is about social change, and so the language really makes a huge difference.
Thank you. We're gonna, we have about 20-ish minutes. We're gonna open it up to people here who have questions, and I'll repeat the questions too to make sure that you hear them. So does anybody have something that's bubbling right now? Of the what?
Style guides.
Oh. Where can we get a list of the style guides that you've recommended?
In the chat, because you all can access that where you're sitting.
I was gonna say, yeah, I saw one come through the chat. And we can share some too. Email them out or put them in the Facebook group too.
We're dropping links in there right now.
Oh yeah. Look at him go. Yeah, Jill. Hey. Jill.
Is there like a template that you could recommend if you wanted to start like do we use one that you guys have provided, or can we share somewhere that we should start? If that's always the first part, where do we start?
There a template that a church could use to start their own style guide, or start off with something that's already been discussed. Basically, where do we start?
Well, I know that our firm, that's actually a service that we are offering now. So we have a very similar to when we do marketing and content work for our clients, we create like a proofing guide. It's the same process where we essentially go over your values and goals of an organization. And then we go over the terms and what's important as far as like more, different topics that you speak about more and like hone in on that. But there is like a basic terminology template that we do offer. I'm trying to think if I can remember of anything online currently that's like a free downloadable template.
For very budget limited congregations.
So that would be helpful for congregations who have a limited budget.
The ELCA has a style guide as well. I think it's last update was 2018. So, but our church has a style guide that we created a number of years ago. But some of what you're saying has kind of made me think in a different way. You know, ours is, I brought, if anybody wants to see it afterwards, I brought ours, but it has like what fonts to use and what colors to use and how not to, you know. And then we have a section where we follow the ELCA style guide in terms of whether to capitalize certain things, that sort of thing. But I like the idea that this is always evolving because this is kind of a static thing here, and I just hand it out to the employees. And but I like the idea of always being aware of changes in terminology, how our own congregation.
You just referenced. I heard that in the I heard some of what you said there too, and I don't think anyone here, maybe someone on the panel here is an expert in this too, but I know there'd be a whole accessibility piece of this as well that's important to consider. And when I heard you say fonts, like that made me think of that, and that's one thing that we're like trying to both learn and incorporate at GLAD too, and we're having partners and people lead us too. But that's another area to consider that I don't think we've talked about yet here.
Do you have any more to say about that? Anyone else on the panel about fonts?
I'm not the lead on this. I will share some of the things that I've just picked up, but I think we need to we could pull in another group like adaptability, or there's some other groups that have kind of been partners of GLADs that also are a bit more media focused. And I don't know if they have their own particular style guides, but the few things that I would say, I know that there, for some people, serifs, those little lines at the tops and the bottoms of words and letters, can either make it very hard for people to read, or sometimes it can make it easier for people to read. The color contrast, I do a lot of PowerPoint presentations and websites, and there are some places that you can like send a website to, and it will let you know if you have enough color contrast between the background color and the foreground color. So, black on a very light yellow, I think, is one of the best ones for color contrast, but having a very light color on top of another light color is very hard to read for context. And then other things I think I'll just throw out that I've picked up. If you're doing social media with hashtags, capitalizing each word allows screen readers to be able to read it. If you don't capitalize, the screen reader just sees it as a bunch of letters. Spirit Day is a campaign GLAD is doing right now. We just like reiterate everyone, Spirit Day, hashtag capital S, Spirit, capital D, Day, and then that can actually be read. And then the other thing that we're trying to do is if you've got the ability, if you've got a blog or backend, things like that, for photos, things like alt text, things that can also do descriptions of what's in the photos as well, that again, readers can pick up. That's a handful of things that I've sort of been working with, some just within the last few months, not comprehensive at all, but some things to think about. And then I'll see if we can find one from like adaptability or one of the partners that GLAD's work with that focus on disability specifically.
And one of the most obvious ones, I don't think you said this, Ross, I apologize if you did. We did a redesign a few years ago. An outside firm did it, and the smallest type was like 6-point type for captions or whatever. And so we tried to bump it up, but their design was kind of contingent upon some of these too small, in my opinion, typefaces. So the size of the font you choose. And just on a footnote to what you said, Ross, whenever we're doing a reverse print over a color, it almost inherently needs to be increased size because it's harder to read that kind of type over color.
So I come from a journalism background as well, and our church has a style guide. But do you have any tips or ideas for how to get the rest of the staff who do not have a communication background and are not word nerds to care about the style guide and to adhere to it?
Did you hear that question?
Drop, kick, and punch.
You may want to repeat what I sort of heard is that, yeah, that you all care. And then of course, there's other people that are communicating on behalf of the congregation that, that how do you make sure that they're on track? We have this all the time too. I mean, we sort of say like, GLAD has this guide. We have to make sure our own people are following our own rules. And one of the first things that I do with onboarding anyone that is working for me, interns, new staff, things like that, this should be one of the go-to reads that they have. They, you kind of only have to like read it once, but then you also know that it exists and you're going to refer back to it with those question marks. And then, it's a little bit of monitoring. If your style guide will be shorter, like I said, if it's only a couple pages of some of the most common things that you know that you're doing or saying with some of those links, that's an easier read and also can be an easier sort of reminder for folks too of this is what we do. And then preemptively think about stuff like this. You've got seasons of the church year where you're going to use certain words more than you use other words. You're going to use certain images more than you use other words. So you can actually create something, a little staff email that says, Advent and Christmas is coming up. A few things just to remember, right? And so that can be, you can think through what are some of the confusing things or things that don't seem consistent for us, and just say, keep in mind this for the way that we're going to talk or what images we're going to use. And those seasonal reminders can kind of keep it front of mind when you know they're going to be saying or using certain words at certain times.
Yeah, I think talking about style guides just on a regular basis can be really valuable. I think a lot of times style guides can feel to those who don't have, a big love for them as something that is restricting them or, just another task that they have to do or some other rules that they have to follow. And so I think providing any opportunity to have like conversations as to why you're using certain language, why you're, adding new language to your guide, I think it just really adds that element of care, and that's what every word should be. Like adding a new word, changing a word, it's an act of care for your message, for your community, for those who are receiving your messages. And so I think anytime you can add that personal connection to a style guide, it can help just one, for people to see what they can contribute to it and the value, seeing themselves reflected in it, seeing what words resonate with them. But then also just creates a constant dialogue around it, that these aren't, increasingly with the internet, they're not static documents anymore, that these are things that can change at a much more rapid rate, which can really benefit us. So just having, whether that's a formal sit down or whether it's just, encouraging casual conversation where people feel like they can ask why, ask questions, propose new things, I think can create more excitement and energy around a style guide.
And also, as much as I love style guides, they're really only an extension of, inclusion as a whole. And so I think staying in alignment with that, and kind of pushing that is going to really make people just naturally care. And, whatever, depending on what your values are, I think just making sure that the culture is aligning with that will definitely help people have the right intentions to want to make sure that they're following the guide and ask the why and have those conversations, but just understanding, or I guess focusing on the umbrella, which is inclusion, which is the message you're trying to get out, and however you guys communicate, just keep that top of mind. I think that's a great way.
Yeah, at Sojourners, and perhaps Jim Rice can speak more about this, but we had a Slack channel that was just called Style Guide, and we would ask questions about, hey, I'm editing the story, or I'm looking to push this story out. There's this word in it. I'm not sure if it's the word that I should be using. Is there another word? How do I approach this? How do I talk to, if I wasn't the writer, how do I talk to someone else about the language they're using? Is this language just language they identify with? Do they just not know? And so I think just having those platforms of being able to have those honest conversations about style can be, there are ways of integrating into your current systems that don't have to be like a whole big change to your organization.
And that raises a question that I think maybe should have been earlier, not toward the end of our conversation, but for us, we have some pretty strong commitment to a set of style things, but we also want to really honor the author's voice. And sometimes that can come into tension, and an author may want to do one thing stylistically, and we may have a different style. And so trying to be flexible, but also honor the parameters that we've set out. So that's can be a tension in word and style choice.
I was thinking kind of a little bit of what you were saying, Christina, too, is especially if you're like in the process of kind of like rebuilding, like getting buy-in from your staff, like that they're a part of it and they might feel more ownership. I know just in our communications team, we've been having some of those conversations. When Bob was on sabbatical, nobody knew how to edit anything because it was Bob's style guide. And so our team kind of decided like, okay, we're going to try to follow AP with a few exceptions and stuff like that. And then when Bob came back, we kind of talked through those exceptions. And then even just a couple weeks ago, we were like, okay, when we do times, if it's 11 o'clock, are we going to do zeros or not? And we just kind of all were like, this is what we think looks good, and that decision. So I think, the more buy-in you get from the other people who want to use the style guide, they're going to be more committed.
I find also that I know in our church, some of our staff, like it took some of the pressure off of them, like what, because before we had a brand and specific typefaces like that, people were struggling, it was all over the place and it felt very disconnected. I know one or two of our staff is always so thankful and keeps, even if this is like 10 years old or but they keep telling me, I'm so glad that you have this because I don't have to think about it. I can just do what it says. I
don't know if you heard that. She was saying that some people on her staff really appreciate having the guidelines so they don't have to make the choices. Any more questions?
Question?
Yeah.
No, I want to though thank everybody that's been on our panel. I do have a couple of comments for maybe even for them to make, but I was going to share one thing that that I found helpful at the office that Brenda and I think discovered was a book called Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous peoples. And that's been, for me, it's been helpful, especially in talking about some things about tribes and stuff where I wasn't sure or confident with what language should be used. I looked for it this morning. I was going to bring it along, but I couldn't find it. So, but I wanted to just give that out as one of the examples. Now it is a 110-page book, so it's not like it's something you can just make a couple of downloads from, but it's the kind of thing that's out there that can help us think through our language usage. Christina was talking about, the Slack channel that Sojourners use to do that. I think if you're looking for help, go to our communicators Facebook page, and you can throw a question up there. Sometimes it doesn't get answered. I know Ian put one up there and nobody answered it. It's fun sometimes. Use our group as a way to, since very few of you have more than yourself on staff that are working on communications. So I think that would be a way to support each other. I suspect our panelists probably would take questions too if there's specific questions. And I'm going to make a pitch for Nuger because we've used Nuger for hosting our website for the last 9 years. And I used Nuger before that for Metro Lutheran newspaper. Great resource. I met Khai at this Common Good event. Khai, do you want to say anything about what those Common Good events are and how folks here might even be able to take advantage of some of the information you share there?
Yeah, so our Common Good Breakfast series actually started pre-COVID in person, and the one that we were just at was the first one back actually since the pandemic, so that was fun. But they're essentially networking opportunities where we have a panel discussion. The topics range from professional development to more harder topics, for example, like combating racism, which is one that we had a lot of success with last spring. And the conversation was so good that we had to do a part 2. And so we have a lot of recap content, whether that's on our website or through an email. So currently right now we do have recap information from the Combating Racism, and we had an inclusive language common good series where we had a panelist of journalists and people working in the media, where we spoke about language guides as well there. So we have some resources from that event. Honestly, we can just take a visit to our website. Is probably the best way to get in contact so that you can stay up to date when we do have our next common good. Proceeds of the event do go to a small nonprofit that changes each event. We do them about 2 times a year. And this year was hybrid. I'm assuming moving forward, it will probably be hybrid again. And yeah, so we really listen to the community, and we really look at what's going on. For example, the last one we just had was National Inclusion Week. So we had another conversation about inclusive language with a very diverse panel. And so, yeah, I invite you all to follow us so that you can stay up to date and hopefully come and attend one.
And Dave Newber, who just stood up to leave, hasn't got enough, out to have another phone call, but Dave is the founder of Newber, and so you can interrupt him during his phone call. Wait till afterwards, okay, to talk to him. But I do think that it is a real resource, and they understand churchiness. They're not a church communications organization only, but they do get us. So I'd encourage people to think about that if you end up needing to look for places like that. I want to know if you all have any questions for each other. Did any of you say something that you either questioned or that stimulated a thought that makes you want to ask one of your co-panelists about?
I'm really intrigued about the fonts that you were mentioning, Ross. I'm actually working on revamping our language style guide. I'm working on different movements and religious terminology. So I'm just curious. I don't know if you can share any more resources, or did you share in the chat already?
I didn't. Honestly, most of the things that I named are probably places where I messed up and someone said, here's the problem I have with that. And I was like, okay, I fixed it, like on a case-by-case basis, but like don't have any further like background on it. Mostly I've just been taking correction as I've messed up.
Okay. Yeah, that's really intriguing. So that I thank you for that. We also do design work too. So that's definitely something that we should be looking into. So thanks for sparking that.
So I think the 3 words that I heard most often, and it's, I think, an argument for why style guides are important, and it gets at how to even attract our colleagues and make them realize how important they are, is intentionality, impact, and inclusion. Really, there's in a lot of ways, language is about hospitality. And I think that we either welcome people or we uninvite them from our space. As the people that do words here in this room, it's important for us to remember we have that much power, that we actually can make it a safe space, we can make it a welcome space, or we can push people away. And I think that we got challenged by our panelists to really think with intentionality about the impact of that when we try to be inclusive and do the work. And so I really want to thank the 4 of you for what I think was a really impressive panel and a really great time. I'm excited to show this to my staff at the Synod office so we pull them into how important this all is. And I think we'll hopefully, if everybody's okay, is everybody okay if we share this? Nobody's?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay. So we'll make this recording available to you and, use it as you best can too. So thank you all very much. And we'll let you we'll dismiss you so you can do the other things you need to do with words today. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Um,